Sometimes, if you want to learn about humanity, you have to go visit a planet full of highly evolved giant spiders. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, I want to do a review of Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time series, or at least the first three books in the series: Children of Time, Children of Ruin, and Children of Memory. There is a fourth book coming out, Children of Strife, that comes out in March of 2026. So obviously, this is a little preemptive. It's not the whole series, but I think these three books work well as a trilogy almost. And I love these books, so I really wanted to share them with you. Now, right at the top, I will say I'm not going to share anything that I think are really spoilers in this video. There is a slight amount of information I have to give to build out the world and explain some of the ideas that Tchaikovsky is playing with. I don't think they're spoilers. I think if you read, it's all on the jacket copy of each of the books. If you want to be totally blind, and if you don't read jacket copies of books, then this will be a little bit spoilerish. But none of the information I'm going to share is more than what you'd find when you read a blurb about the book. So take that as you will. And so I'm sure many of you have heard of the series. It is, this incredibly epic sci-fi series that takes place thousands and thousands of years in the future. And so I want to talk about the plotting and the writing and the ideas because that's what's most important to me. To build it up, I have to explain what the core story is that all of the other stories build off of. Now, the stories don't follow a single character throughout the three books. They follow groups of characters, do kind of move from one book to another, but the characters themselves, while they're the heart of the book in many ways, they aren't the point. So this is similar if you've read Tchaikovsky's Tyrant Philosopher series. So there are three books in that series. And each of those books also have characters that move throughout the books, but the books are looking at a different event and a different way of understanding the world in each of those books. So the books build out the world and they use characters just as a bridge to move from one part of the world to another. And here in this series, the world is these infinite galaxies. And so I need to talk about the plotting of the books in order to talk about the ideas that I think are the heart of these books that I really enjoy. But that will come a little bit later. So first, what is the basis of these books? Where the books start, the prologue or opening part of the first book serves as the basis for all of these books. So these books start thousands of years in our future on Earth, where we have developed, technology to move into far distant galaxies in space. We have developed technology that allows us to terraform other planets, like intensely terraform at a rapid rate, including changing their atmosphere and so forth. We have developed technology that allows humans to go into suspended animation for long periods of time, which allows us to travel these great distances across space. So we haven't developed faster than light speed travel. There's no light speed or warp speed travel, I should say, but we have developed technology that will allow humans to go into a suspended state, allow AIs to run the ship, and then 1,000 years later, they wake up when they're at their destination. So that is kind of where we're at. And the story starts with the completion of the terraforming of this planet. Now, there are a number of planets that are in the process of being terraformed for eventual human colonization, but we're at the one that was the first one. And the woman, Avarna Kern, Dr. Kern, I should say, who is like the architect of the terraforming project. This is her baby, her planet. And the terraforming is essentially done. And so that is where our story starts. Now, there are other planets that are in different states of terraforming all over the galaxy or multiple galaxies. But this is the main one that is essentially done. The terraforming has been completed. And all that's left to do is the final step of the terraforming is they have developed a nanovirus that causes advanced evolution, that causes evolution to happen at an incredibly rapid rate. And the idea is to infect a number of monkeys with this virus and then let the monkeys go live on this planet. So then in the future, when humans come to then colonize this planet, the monkeys will have evolved into either humans or proto-humans and will have developed communities and structures. So the humans that come to colonize it won't be coming to a totally blank planet. They'll have some sort of infrastructure that they can move into. Now, the morality of that in and of itself is gray and interesting, which is something he plays with. But so that's the idea, and that's where we start. However, you find out there are other groups that don't like this idea. That the idea of forced evolution goes against nature, goes against biology, and depending on which side of the argument you're on, they either engage in an act of what you could think of as liberation or as terrorism. But what they do is they create a virus, a digital virus that destroys the computer systems for all of the ships that exist, that are linked to Earth in any way. So all of the terraforming ships go dark and they die out. They get lost wherever they are in the galaxy. This results in a huge, massive war on Earth, which then basically kills off most of the population and ushers in a second ice age. Okay? And now, thousands of years go past that ice age, and a new human race evolves on Earth, out of the destruction of the planet, and they are still able to advance their technology to a point, building off of their predecessors, that is much more advanced than what we have now. So they're able to engage in similar suspended animation and in similar interstellar travel and so forth. But Earth is dying and close to dead. So they developed these generation ships, these arc ships, where 50,000 humans might go on this ship. And they have found the coordinates of a bunch of these terraformed planets that their predecessors terraformed. And they don't know the state of those planets. They don't know if the terraforming was done. They don't know anything about it, except that they have these coordinates and they know that Earth is no longer habitable. So a bunch of these generation ships, or these arc ships with, tens of thousands of people in suspended animation, leave Earth and in search of other planets to live on, and in search of saving humanity in that way. And that is the basis. That is the basis of the world that all of these books take place in. Now, I'll talk about how each of the 3 books play with that in a different way when I get to the plotting. But first, let's just go over kind of the generals, the writing. Adrian Tchaikovsky's writing is always incredibly fun and incredibly propulsive. So the writing is really smart and it grabs the reader right away. Now, I think his writing is incredibly funny. Sometimes it's in the narrative voice, or sometimes there are specific characters, but it's this dry wit that it isn't quite sarcasm or cynicism, but it kind of pushes up against that line quite often, and just in the way the narrator chooses to frame things. And it makes me laugh out loud continuously reading all these books. They aren't satire. They aren't meant to be comedy or humor, but just the way things are described. Sometimes, whether it be, like I said, the narrator taking a step back and describing something in a certain way, or sometimes, especially in the 3rd book, certain character interactions. It is meant to be humorous, and it's meant to lighten the mood of what are these really weighty and heavy ideas that he's exploring. So I think the writing is really funny, but more than that, it's propulsive. He balances in each of these books multiple storylines, and because of that, he does a really good job at building up a storyline to increase the tension to where you need to find out the answer, and then switching to the other storyline. And he, that's an old narrative trick, right? Moving from one point of view to another, but he does it in such a way that's really compelling, and it makes you first immediately frustrated because you want to find out the answer to what he was building up so effortlessly, but then right away you're invested in the second storyline again. And so he weaves these storylines in and out of each other in a way, and he does it differently across all books, importantly, but every time it really increases the tension to pull you along. Now, all of these books are long. They're about 600 pages each. They don't read that way. They read incredibly quickly. It is hard sci-fi insofar as all of the science and the technology is important, and it's based on contemporary science and technology that we know. There's a whole bunch of xenobiology that's quite important in these stories, but you don't have to care about the science. The science is there to further the story. So you don't have to get caught up on any of that. Any of the technology, any of the ideas, they're big ideas that are playing on the edges of our contemporary understanding of technology and science, and they're critical for the story and for how the story develops, yet they're not a stumbling block. It's very easy to read, and it's made for a wide audience. So the writing is smart, it's propulsive, it includes really thoughtful ideas and explorations of current technology and science, and extrapolates where those may be in a couple thousand years, but it doesn't do so in a way that ever looks down on its audience. So the writing is tight, smart, propulsive. Now the world building, I'll talk about a little more, but so the basis of the world. He continues to do world building with his character work, especially throughout all 3 books. And one of the things that I think Adrian Tchaikovsky is great at doing in all of his novels is he does world building in such a way that he gives you both the micro and the macro. He gives you this zoomed in focus of the world in very specific areas through very specific points of view, but then he also zooms out to let you see a much wider, more expansive world. And he shows how those two are related to one another. And he does so in a really compelling and interesting way. So the world building here, I think, is really thoughtful. It's really expansive. It's really inviting. It really is something you want to be part of, even though it does involve a dead Earth and the last dregs of humanity just scraping to survive. It is still really exciting, right? And it feels complete. It doesn't feel convenient or temporary in any way. It feels fully lived in and realized. So I have nothing but compliments to give for both the writing and the world building. The character work also, I think, is phenomenal. And now the interesting thing about the character work in these books, especially the first book, is that some of the characters are technically archetypes. He's looking at generations of characters. And so when you're looking at generations of characters, sometimes it is done with this archetypical way. Other times, it is specific characters that you follow throughout the course of the novel, and a mixture of these archetypical characters, which I'll explain in a moment. That sounds strange, but a mixture of that with specific characters that move across the span of the novel and maybe into other novels as well. And yet with all the characters, whether they're human or non-human or, AI or sentient in any other way, they're incredibly detailed. They're incredibly robust. They feel fully realized, right? And Some of them you want to spend time with, some of them you don't want to spend time with because they're kind of awful. But he has this wonderful blend of characters that bounce off of each other. They feel real and genuine, and they are detailed enough that even these ones that are what I'm calling archetypical characters still feel embodied in important ways. They don't feel flat. They're not stock characters that he pulled out of some dusty catalog, okay? So the character work is an important part of the story because the story is told through the characters. Really, the heart of the story and all the ideas he's exploring is done through the plotting, but also through the characters. So I think his character work is phenomenal, and I loved spending time with all of the characters in these books. So now let me get to the plots of the 3 books and how that ties into the ideas that he's exploring, because I think that is important. Like I said, each of the 3 books is exploring 2 different timelines, or 2 different storylines rather, that interweave and then finally converge near the end. And he does this differently in the 3 books. So the first book, one of the timelines we're following is on this planet because they released this nanovirus, as I mentioned. And this is critical for the whole series as well. They released this nanovirus, but they didn't ever release the monkeys. However, they had already began creating ecosystems on this planet. And so there are a number of arthropods, such as spiders and insects, and other invertebrates, such as especially ocean-dwelling invertebrates. And the scientists kind of neglected that when they designed this nanovirus, the intent was that it would only affect monkeys. So it was specialized, so it wouldn't affect the evolution of any other mammals or any other vertebrates. But they neglected to consider how it might affect invertebrates. So as a result, you have these spiders that are evolving at an incredibly rapid rate, as well as other animals on this planet. None as much as the spiders, though. So the spiders are evolving is eventually to a place where they have a level of intelligence that is equal to contemporary humans, and then beyond that. And so you're following the storyline of their evolution, of their developing of cities, and you see them evolve through different stages of evolution. You see them develop ideas of religion. You see them develop ideas of community. You see them go to war with each other. You see them create peace treaties and armistice, and you see them have different levels of social development and so forth. So you follow the evolution of these characters, and that's what I mean when I say they're archetypical characters, because within this storyline, the spiders tend to live for about 30 years, give or take, human years. And they are about the size of a human head or, a human torso. So that's how large they've evolved. And so because of that, he's looking at the span of hundreds and hundreds of lives, multiple generations of these spiders. So he's created archetypes. This is based off of the ported spider, which is a type of jumping spider. So the main spider we follow is named Portia. And there are other spiders such as Bianca or Fabian. And each of those spiders creates an archetype within this spider community, right? So our main spider that we follow is Portia. So all of the Portias and all of the generations of Portias tend to have similar traits of being adventurous, of caring about community, of being these intrepid explorers and so forth. And the Biancas tend to be leaders that tend to be stronger and more muscular and more warriors and so forth. So he creates these archetypes within the spider communities so you can move from one generation to the next and still have some continuity of character. And even though you know logically or intellectually that as you're moving across hundreds of years of these spiders' evolution, that you're dealing with different individual spiders, it still feels like the evolution of a single character. So even though there is this archetypical character work, it is done in a way that feels compelling and smart and has a through line, right? So that's one story. We're following the evolution of these spiders on this planet until they develop the level of sentience and beyond that we have now. The other storyline is following one of these generational ships that has left the dead Earth, and they find this terraforming planet that's full of spiders, and with the intent that they want to land there and create a new human colony. So we are following them in space, and we're following them over these hundreds of years as well. So what happens is they will all go into a deep sleep. They'll wake up, and you'll experience them as they wake up then, and they deal with where they are in space, what's going on, and then they have to go back to sleep, and they travel another couple hundred years and so forth, all aiming for this destination and meeting this planet, expecting it to have some sort of human life there, because they still believe that these monkeys were probably released on this planet. They don't expect there to be giant, terrifying spiders. But so because of that, these two storylines are moving in parallel timelines, right? You're following the two storylines chronologically together. And so you're seeing the evolution of the spider society. And now, of course, not all the humans are being woken up every time, only the leadership, right? Most of the humans are kept in deep sleep, because to have 50,000 humans awake on the ship would be impractical. They don't have the resources for it. But the humans, the core team that is woken up over and over again, there's a constant disorientation, and there's infighting, and there are rebellions. So as the spiders evolve and show what it means to create community, the humans devolve into fighting and into quarreling and into destroying each other, even though they need to rely on one another in order to get to this planet to hopefully save humanity, because they believe they are all that's left of the human race. Now, at the time of this first book, you don't know, but In the other books, you find out there are other generational arcs, these giant ships that have survived, but none of them are in contact with one another. So to the characters in this book, they are all that's left of humanity. So even with that as their stakes, they still are fighting with each other. And so looking at these two lenses, some of the things he's exploring is not just community, but also what does humanity look like? What does society look like? What does it mean to get along with others? And what does it mean to incorporate yourself into something bigger than yourself? What does it mean to be an individual in a community that is growing and developing? Or what is more important, right? The individual self or the whole? And how can one individual character fit into that? And now another big thing that comes up is communication. When they eventually get into the orbit of this planet and they try to communicate with the spiders that are on the planet and so forth. And I'll get into that a little more because communication is an overarching theme that he explores in all of his stories. But so in this first one, the plotting is done in such a way that you have these two parallel storylines happening, right? So then jumping to Children of Ruin, the second novel, we do have a group of adventurers from the end of our first story that continue, but their individuality doesn't matter that much. It's more about exploring a new part of the galaxy, a new part of the world. And in this story, instead of highly evolved spiders, we are introduced to octopuses, highly evolved octopuses. And now this novel also has two storylines, but instead of being two parallel storylines, they are two atemporal storylines. The first storyline is following one of the original group of terraformers who are trying to terraform this planet. And they happen to be at a place where there are two planets right next to each other. And they had planned to terraform one, and the other is a satellite or a moon, essentially. But they realize that there already exists alien life form on this planet they're planning on terraforming. So instead, one group decides to investigate that existing life form, and the other group decides to terraform what was the moon, right? And the reason they hadn't originally planned on terraforming that is because it is something like 90% water or ice at this point, but after terraforming it, it would be 90% water. And so they'd have to create a whole world of floating cities and floating rafts. And so that wasn't considered ideal. But at this point, they say, well, we might as well try. So you have these original terraformers that exist thousands of years in the past doing their work. And the other storyline is following a group of adventurers from the spider planet, essentially. And they are exploring, and as you can imagine, they are making their way to this planet. And so you have these two storylines happening, but they're atemporal. So as our adventurers are finding this planet and trying to see what's going on here, you see how that planet evolved and devolved and went up and down and so forth, and what happened to our original group of terraformers. And so having this atemporal storyline is really interesting because it builds up tension in ways that doesn't happen when you have parallel storylines. Now, you know, of course, that these storylines are going to intersect. Eventually, you are going to see not just the planet and the beings on the planet that our adventurers come to meet, but how they became who they are. And that itself creates this sense of inevitability and this sense of fate, right? Because you see progression and you see the end at the same time. So you see how things develop and how things result. And it is that journey that is something that is being explored. But it gives you this idea of inevitability, of things are always going to happen in a way, and now you have to find out what your role is in that playing out of events, okay? It also has these ideas of ingenuity and exploration. What does it mean to go to a new place? What is your responsibility when you are visiting a new world or a new species or a new community, a new society? How are you able to engage with them in a meaningful way? If you do believe that you are the last remaining group of humans, is it your responsibility to save humanity, or is it your responsibility to be shepherds of whatever place you land and let their community exist? Why do humans have some sort of priority, right? Or wherever society you come from. So this idea of colonization, this idea of what do you lose of yourself when you take over someone else, when you colonize a place, whether it be a community or a person or a society or a world, are you giving up part of your own humanity in order to overpower others in that way? And how does power corrupt humanity? Or does it have to corrupt humanity? Can power be used in a benevolent way? Right? Can you be expansionist in a way that is benevolent to everyone involved, or is it necessarily corrupting? So these are ideas that are explored, linked into these alternating timelines that are asynchronous, that are looking at ideas of fate and inevitability, and how evolution, especially when guided by human ingenuity, doesn't always go the way you anticipate it to go. And how does that work into your ideas of the inevitability of human life and human sentience? So the second story, where we have these, evolved octopuses and this asynchronous storyline, is looking at these kind of ideas. And so in the third novel, The Children of Memory, again, you have a set of adventurers who come from, let's say, the octopus planet, or the result of the interaction with the octopus planet. And then the other storyline is following at first original terraformers who are cut off when this digital virus is sent out by the terrorist group, quote unquote. And they hadn't done a lot of work yet to terraform the planet they're on, but they're trying to salvage what they can, and then another generational ship that is coming to that planet, hoping that it will be able to sustain human life. So again, with 50,000 humans in deep sleep and a small crew running the ship that has been traveling for millennia. So this ship has been traveling for 2 millennia, essentially. So at the time, more or less, that this ship reaches this planet is more or less synchronous with a lot of the events we've already been learning about in the other books. So there isn't these huge time gaps because they're able to go into the suspended animation for so long. So the interesting thing about the way Tchaikovsky uses time in this third story is, instead of the first story has these parallel timelines, right? The parallel chronologies. The second story has asynchronous chronologies. This one, it is incredibly disruptive chronologies. It feels like you're starting in one place, then moving forward, and going backwards again, and going in circles like a whirlwind. So the chronology is confusing on purpose. It's not accidental, but the chronology itself seems to repeat itself. It seems cyclical. It seems like you are exploring something and then reverting backwards, then going forward again. So it is this chronology that's following 2 different groups of characters, right? These 2 storylines where they intersect in ways that you can't understand until you get more than 2/3 of the way through the novel. There is this intentional level of confusion about how time is slippery, and about how our experience of time is slippery, and our experience of self is slippery, how things aren't nearly as straightforward as they seem, right? So he really brings in this idea of time and this idea of the cyclical nature of time, this idea of time and experience of time being a disruptive force in our understanding of the world. And so it's done in an entirely different way, right? And in this story, you have these ideas of sentience coming up, especially in personhood. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to succeed as a person? What does it mean to be sentient? What does it mean to be part of a community? And then he also has these ideas, especially because this colony you eventually are following, they are barely able to survive. This planet had been terraformed to allow for human life, but barely, just barely. You can barely grow anything. It's like a real hard scrabble kind of life. And so there is this question of what does it mean to exist in such a way where your material needs are barely being met, versus the highly evolved societies that don't have any material needs anymore. They've already developed ways to negotiate all of their material needs. So how does community or society or personhood or identity or your understanding and experience of the world develop in those 2 different extremes? One where you are constantly struggling to meet your material needs, and one where you have excess and you have no needs at all. And what is left to flourish when you don't have to struggle with the world around you? And what is stymied or held back when your whole life is a struggle, right? So those are some of the ideas that are explored in this, as well as the idea of, can you help a society without interfering in it? So at some point, our adventurers come to this colony and they see it, and there's this debate, but how can they be of assistance to this colony? Can they allow to help evolve this colony to give it more resources that they have available to them, since their technology is more advanced, without actually disrupting the society, without coming in as saviors or without coming in as colonizers? Can they come in as somehow beneficial actors that, without condescension and without great social disruption, benefit this community in some way and advance them to allow them a better quality of life? How can you engage with the other in such a way as to leave them complete and whole and not totally transformed by their interaction with you, and yet still leave them better off as a result? Is that possible? Or do you always bring a part of yourself and stain others with your own identity, right? How does experience work in that way? So the third book is about experience and the distinction between experience and reality. So that is the overall plot of the 3 books, but you see how he plays with time and narrative structure in such a way to emphasize different ideas. So the narrative structure and the plotting is intentional. It isn't accidental. And he does it differently in each book because he wants to highlight something else. Now, along with that, he plays with genre quite a lot. So the first book is very much an exploratory sci-fi novel, like very, very much. You're looking at xenobiology, you're looking at evolution, you're looking at exploring new worlds, you're looking at trying to save the human race. And it's very much a typical sci-fi novel. Now, the other 2 are also hard sci-fi. Like, don't pretend they're not sci-fi. Yet, the second novel has these horror vibes, especially in the center part, that you feel this horror sci-fi mixed in. And it is really exciting to see, I think. The third novel feels like a fantasy novel in many ways, right? It feels like you're on a colonial farmstead, and it reminded me of Robert Eggers' The Witch and other stories like that, where you have the small community that's afraid of what lives in the woods. Okay, so it feels like a fantasy. It just happens to take place on a planet that is, millennia of light years away from Earth, and there are interstellar beings that are interceding in the life of this planet. So he plays with genre in an interesting way, and I don't know that the genre necessarily is having a direct impact on the message or the ideas that he's playing with, or there's a direct connection, but it is interesting to see some similar ideas played out in these different genre tropes, because he has some ideas that he's playing with in all of them, and he's looking at some ideas across the whole series. One of the big ones being communication. What does it mean for society if you aren't able to understand one another? And this is something I see come up again and again in Tchaikovsky's work. What does it mean to actually know other people, right? And here, by people, we mean not just humans, but also spiders and octopuses, or in the case of the third novel, corvids. So these crow-raven hybrids that have been evolved. What does it mean to know the other? What does it mean to know other people? And if you aren't able to communicate easily, then how are you able to create harmony? How are you able to share ideas in a meaningful way that doesn't involve strong-arming or overpowering or some other sort of either psychological or physiological destruction, right? So communication, I think, is incredibly important, and he's constantly exploring what does it mean to be in communication with others. And you see that explored through sci-fi and horror and fantasy in really fun ways, because he's playing with the tropes of each of those genres to look at that idea. In addition to the idea of communication, he's looking at ideas of community and society and humanity. What does it mean to be a human or a person in these different ways of being, in these different environments, right? What does it mean to feel like you are the last of humanity? And does that mean you have an overarching responsibility to save humanity no matter what the cost? Or does it mean you need to let the idea of humanity go and instead evolve into something different that is incorporating what you can learn from other cultures or other communities? Obviously, these stories are looking at colonizing other planets, but the idea is you're colonizing planets that are empty. And yet there's still something destructive about that colonization, right? So it's not the kind of colonization we see contemporary on Earth where you're colonizing another community. This is colonizing an empty planet, yet those echoes are still there. What does it mean to feel ownership of something that isn't yours? What does it mean to go to a place and say, we deserve to be here because it'll benefit us? Right? It doesn't matter if anyone else claims ownership to this. It doesn't matter if this is really a desirable planet for us or not. This is something we deserve, and therefore we have the right to take it, right? What does that mean? So these are ideas he's exploring. What is really lovely about these stories, and I think one of the highlights of it, is he does have these non-human characters. Like I said, in the first one we have spiders, especially in the second one, in addition to spiders, we have these octopuses, and in the third one we have these corvids, right? These crows, raven, hybrid type things. In each of these cases of these non-human characters, they aren't just gimmicks, right? He's actually using their differences from humans and humanity to explore the world and to engage in world building and character depth. So how would these characters understand the world due to their own experience, due to the limited experience of whatever xenobiology he's exploring? And how would their natural evolution cause them to have a different understanding of society or community or world building, right? Or nation building or statehood or personhood? Okay, so it's not simply human characters wearing the skin or the costume of a non-human character, which is what you see in a lot of sci-fi. In a lot of sci-fi, you see people meet these aliens who are incredibly fantastical to look at, right? And they may be described in these really colorful, interesting ways. But at the end of the day, they are just a proxy for humans that look different. That's not the case here. Each of these different non-human species that he has introduced into the story, he does so very meaningfully. And the way they're introduced also impacts the ideas he's reflecting on in that story. So with the introduction of spiders in the first story, an important part of understanding how these spiders evolve is looking at the actual spiders and how they create communities, how they create societies. And so from that basis, that evolutionary basis, how can they create an understanding of personhood and of statehood, for that matter? And then how would that interact with humans' understanding of it? So the very nature of the spiders themselves is critical to developing the world. And the same thing with the octopuses. And it's not simply like what kind of spaceships would an octopus travel in. Like that is not the important thing, right? That is there and is really interesting. And he does explore the limits of their biology in ways that is important. Like he doesn't gloss over anything, which is where some of the science gets a little wonky, especially in a good way, not in a bad way. But like, what does it mean for like a group of sentient octopuses that have evolved in such a state that they are exploring space? Like what would a spacecraft look like for an octopus? That's very interesting, but that's not the point. The point of it is, what are the natural limitations and the natural unique characteristics of an octopus that would then, as a result of this evolution, serve as a mirror or a lens through which you can understand humanity? And the same thing, especially in the last book, when you have these corvids, because the corvids are really interesting, where there are two of them, and they are specialized. So one corvid is able to always seek out new things. He's able to recognize distinction and is always interested in finding new things, right? Learning new information. And he can recognize when things change. But he doesn't have any ability to process that information. He's just able to recognize it and pull it out. Whereas the other one, the other mating pair, isn't able to necessarily recognize new things, but then when given a whole lot of information, the other one is able to then process that and to reach some sort of deduction. And so the two of them work together, and they have this idea that maybe between the two of them, they exist as one person. They're one sentient being across their two minds, because their minds operate in such wildly different ways that they need to be paired together in order to create the semblance of a singular entity. Tchaikovsky isn't throwing in these non-human characters just for color. He's doing it because he wants to explore what it means to be human, and he wants to explore the idea of evolving humanity in such a way that it can become more inclusive and more embracing of diversity, but also of humanity, right? Allow humanity to embrace humanity. And the way he does that is by exploring the xenobiology and the xenoevolution in these non-human species, and specifically looking at the different character traits of the way they communicate, the way they understand society, the way they understand the world around them, and what does that mean for humans, right? And how can that different level of experience or understanding affect the way they engage with humans as well? And what do we have to learn from that? So I don't think I'll harp on that anymore, except to say that the introduction of non-human characters isn't flippant, and it is critical to the story because it allows him to explore humanity in very, very interesting ways and very smart ways as well, right? And none of it is accidental. And the choice of what non-human species he introduces is not accidental. And the fact that in each book, there are multiple animals or species that you learn about in each book, but really, as far as non-human animals go, there's one that's given a focus in each book. Even though you learn about others on the periphery that you might learn a little bit about, there's one that's given a focus. And that's because he's exploring something about that particular species that is going to allow him to reflect on humanity and on our human characters as well. So he's not trying to throw everything at the wall all at once. He's being very measured, actually, even though this is an incredibly expansive story that has, that crosses, millennia worth of light years of space and galaxy. He is very focused in what he introduces into the story and how he introduces it and how that is going to affect all of the other characters and all of the other world building that is being done. I could go on and on about these books. I could just gush more and more. I have so many more thoughts about them, but I don't want to go on too long. This video is already far longer than it needs to be. Before I conclude, though, I will say that I have read some reviews, and I know some people have the opinion that the first book is the best, and they don't think the second or the third book are as strong as the first book. And I don't agree. I can appreciate that perspective, especially because the character work in the first book is easier. Like getting emotional access to the characters is a lot easier because of these parallel timelines where you're really following one character. Essentially, you sometimes jump to other characters, but you're really following a singular character throughout the whole course of the story. A singular character in each of these timelines, so two characters. It allows you an emotional interiority that's really easy to access. You don't have that same emotional interiority, especially in the second novel, because you're following multiple characters across different timelines that are asynchronous. And so you know that some characters you meet in the beginning aren't going to be there in the end, and there's going to be whole levels of disruption. And so having emotional access to the characters' lives is more difficult in the second story, but that isn't the focus of the second story. So for me, it didn't bother me, and it didn't interrupt my enjoyment of the story. And the other elements of the story that came in, this idea of what does it mean what part of yourself do you lose when you take over something, when you try to wrest control of nature in a way that doesn't belong to you? Do you have to give up part of your humanity to do that? That was more compelling than having the emotional interiority. And which isn't to say there isn't emotional interiority in the second story. It's just not as direct or easy to access as it is in the first one, because there are more characters that you're playing with and the timelines are asynchronous. And because of that, getting to that inside is a little more difficult. So I can understand why people didn't like the second story as much as the first, because the first was really easy to fall into the inner lives of these characters. And in the second, it required more work, and it was a different type of story, right? Because as I said, he's doing something different in each of the stories. Now in the third story, you do fall into the inner life of these characters quite easily, the main ones that you follow, but the story is so disruptive and so confusing that it's hard to kind of be on board, right? Some people think the third story is stronger than the second for that reason. I don't know. I know the third story feels like it could be polarizing because it is playing with ideas of the cyclical nature of time that is really confusing up until about 2/3 of the way through. And even when you get to the revelation of why things are so confusing, it's not accidentally confusing, but you either have to buy into it or not. And maybe not everyone does. I don't know. So I can appreciate that some people feel the first one is stronger and the second and third aren't as strong. I don't feel that way. I do think, just in general, almost every trilogy I've read, there's a belief that the first one is the best and the second and third aren't quite as good. And I think part of that has to do with being introduced to a world for the first time, being introduced to characters for the first time, falling into a new voice for the first time. You can't replicate that experience in a second and third novel in a series, right? So in a second and third novel, you're always falling into something that is somewhat familiar, even though Tchaikovsky goes out of his way to create new things in the second and third books. There's still a level of familiarity, and you're returning to something instead of finding something totally fresh. And that's the case, I think, across almost every series you ever read. So I think it's common to think the first one is the best. Like, that just happens all the time. But you will see that critique, and I can appreciate it. I think it's valid. Like, it's a valid experience of these books. It wasn't my experience of these books. So you should know that going in, that not everyone agrees with me that the books are equally great across all of them. Yet even, at least from what I've read, the people that don't find the second or third book as good as the first still find them compelling and engaging if they like the first one. So that's something to know going into it. So getting that small potential critique out of the way, I'll conclude by saying that, as always, I think Tchaikovsky's writing is propulsive and compelling and inviting. It is serious and smart, yet also funny at the same time. Even though these books are long, you fly through them, and the weight of them, other than the physical weight that may cause, a little bit of difficulty reading, other than that, you don't feel the weight of them. And he is exploring humanity in really interesting and exciting ways. He uses plot and character to explore larger themes, and he does it in a way that is almost invisible. You never feel anything heavy-handed from the authorial point of view, right? Everything is seamless, and it works together in interesting and exciting ways, and each of these books is exploring a different aspect of humanity and doing it in a different way, playing with plot, playing with narrative structure in such a way as to give you something different. As a result of that, I think the three stories feel cohesive and inclusive, and really they are just a lot of fun. Even if you are someone that isn't particularly into sci-fi, I think these books are incredibly accessible, and they care about humans. They care about humanity. They care about what it means to be an individual as part of a community. What does it mean to build a community, and how does your experience of your personhood and of the community affect how you live in the world and how you understand the world around you, especially a world that is full of mysteries that are far broader than you could ever possibly imagine. I think with that, I'll leave it here. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you read this series? What do you think of it? Have you read other works by Tchaikovsky? I think he really does explore similar ideas and themes in many of his books, but he goes about it in different ways, playing with different genres. So I'd love to hear your opinions of those. Also, any other suggestions that are using these expansive type of storytelling to tell very intimate stories like I think he's doing. I'd love to hear those suggestions as well. All of your thoughts, ideas, suggestions, please share them down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourself. Take care of each other and go slowly.